Right now, there are billions of humans spread across this planet, living in cities, crossing continents, and connecting instantly across vast distances. And from the outside, it all feels natural, almost as if this level of dominance was always meant to happen, as if this outcome was inevitable from the very beginning. But when you look closer, when you strip everything back to the human body itself, that assumption starts to fall apart, because humans are not physically impressive in the way other dominant species are. We are not the fastest, not the strongest, and we lack the natural weapons and defenses that define survival in the wild. If you place a human alone in a natural environment, without tools or support, survival becomes uncertain very quickly, and compared to animals that are perfectly adapted to their surroundings, humans seem fragile, exposed, and completely outmatched. And yet, despite all of this, despite every limitation, humans did not just survive. They expanded, adapted, and reshaped the entire world around them. And this contradiction is where the real story begins, because something about us changed the outcome completely. The answer to this contradiction is not as obvious as it seems, because it is not rooted in strength, speed, or even basic intelligence, as other human species once shared many of these traits, and in some cases, even surpassed us physically. Yet they disappeared while we continued to grow and spread across the planet. This means the difference was not something visible or easily measured, but something deeper, something that existed within the structure of the human mind, something that left no clear trace in bones or tools, yet quietly reshaped the way humans interacted with the world and with each other. Over time, across thousands of generations, this subtle shift began to accumulate, not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual progression, where each generation carried forward slightly more refined ways of thinking, communicating, and adapting, until eventually a threshold was crossed. And once that threshold was reached, humans were no longer just reacting to the world around them. They began to interpret it differently, imagine beyond it, and most importantly, share those interpretations with others in a way that allowed ideas to grow, spread, and take on a life of their own. For the first time, humans could think about things that were not physically present. They could imagine future events, recall distant experiences, and construct ideas that existed only in the mind. And this created an entirely new layer of reality that no other species had access to. This new layer did not replace the physical world, but it began to guide how humans acted within it, shaping decisions, influencing behavior, and allowing groups to coordinate based on shared understanding rather than immediate circumstances. Because once ideas could be shared clearly, they could be preserved, refined, and passed forward. And instead of each generation starting from nothing, humans began building on what came before, creating a continuous chain of knowledge that grew stronger over time. And as this chain expanded, so did the ability to adapt, because humans were no longer limited to what they experienced directly. They could learn from others, from stories, and from knowledge that came from places they had never been. At the same time, communication evolved into something far more powerful, transforming into structured language capable of expressing detailed ideas, abstract concepts, and shared plans. And this allowed humans to coordinate actions with a level of precision that no other species could achieve. With this level of coordination, small groups became more efficient, sharing tasks, dividing roles, and supporting one another in ways that increased their chances of survival. And as these systems improved, group sizes began to expand beyond what was previously possible. But the real breakthrough came when humans learned to cooperate not only with those they personally knew, but also with individuals they had never met. And this was made possible through shared beliefs, shared stories, and shared systems of meaning that created trust between strangers. These shared ideas acted as invisible connections, binding people together into larger groups, allowing them to function as unified systems. And this is what allowed human societies to expand far beyond small tribes into large communities capable of achieving far more than any individual alone. From this point forward, progress began to accelerate, as larger groups meant more knowledge, more innovation, and more opportunities to adapt, and each advancement made the next one easier, creating a cycle that continued to build momentum over time. Tools became more refined, strategies became more effective, and humans began to shape their environment instead of simply reacting to it, marking a shift from survival to control, and from adaptation to transformation. Instead of waiting for nature to provide solutions, humans began creating their own, developing tools, using fire, and finding new ways to extract resources from their surroundings, giving them an advantage that extended far beyond physical capability. As these abilities grew, humans began to move beyond their original environments, exploring new territories, adapting to different climates, and learning how to survive in conditions that would have been impossible before. And this expansion further accelerated their development. Eventually, this path led to one of the most significant changes in human history, when humans stopped following nature's patterns and began controlling them directly through agriculture, shifting from finding food to producing it. This shift required staying in one place, building permanent settlements, and organizing life in entirely new ways. And while it introduced new challenges, it also created stability, allowing populations to grow and societies to become more complex. With growing populations came new systems, new roles, and new forms of organization, as people specialized in different tasks, shared resources, and developed structures that allowed larger groups to function effectively, laying the foundation for everything that followed. And from there, the world we recognize today began to take shape, not as a sudden creation, but as the result of countless small changes, each building on the last, each driven by the same core abilities that allowed humans to survive in the first place. Imagination, communication, cooperation, and adaptability, these were the forces that shaped the human journey, and they remain the same forces that continue to shape our world today, guiding the path forward just as they did in the past. But even with all of this progress, one question still remains. Because if these abilities are what made humans successful, then why did other human species not reach the same outcome? And what exactly gave us the final advantage that allowed us to outlast them all? Because at one point in time, we were not alone. The Earth was shared with other human species, beings that looked similar to us, thought in complex ways, used tools, and survived in harsh environments. And yet, one by one, they disappeared. This means that whatever advantage we had was not just about survival, but about long-term dominance, something that allowed us to grow faster, adapt quicker, and organize more effectively than any other species around us. And this is where cooperation at scale becomes the real turning point. Because while other species could work together in small groups, humans learned how to extend cooperation far beyond personal relationships, creating systems that connected large numbers of individuals. This allowed humans to form networks instead of isolated groups, where knowledge, resources, and strategies could move across distances, making entire populations stronger instead of limiting progress to small communities. And as these networks expanded, something even more powerful emerged: the ability to specialize, where individuals no longer needed to do everything, but instead focused on specific roles, becoming more efficient and more skilled in their area. One person could focus on creating tools, another on hunting, another on organizing, and another on sharing knowledge. And this division of roles made the entire group more effective than any individual working alone. But specialization only works when there is trust. Because if individuals rely on each other, they must believe that others will contribute as well. And this is where social systems, reputation, and shared rules began to play a crucial role. Humans developed ways to reward cooperation and discourage those who tried to take without giving back, creating balance within the group and ensuring that the system remained stable over time. And with stability came growth, because once a system works, it allows expansion, and as groups grew larger, they became more capable, more resilient, and more powerful than anything that came before. This growth also led to the creation of trade, where groups began exchanging resources and knowledge, allowing them to access things that were not available in their immediate environment. Trade connected distant communities, turning isolated groups into parts of larger systems. And this further increased the speed at which ideas and innovations could spread across populations. At the same time, shared beliefs continued to strengthen these connections, because when people believe in the same ideas, follow the same rules, and see themselves as part of the same group, cooperation becomes natural rather than forced. This is what allowed humans to organize on a scale that no other species could achieve, not just in small groups, but in communities, societies, and eventually entire civilizations working towards shared goals. And through all of this, the same core pattern remained. Humans adapting, learning, cooperating, and building on what came before, creating a continuous cycle of growth and transformation that continues to shape the world we live in today. As civilizations expanded, a new layer of power emerged, not based on physical strength or direct cooperation, but on systems that could organize millions of people who would never meet, allowing societies to function through shared rules, structures, and expectations that guided behavior across vast distances. These systems were built on collective agreement, on ideas that existed only because people believed in them, and once accepted, they became powerful enough to shape reality, influencing decisions, controlling behavior, and maintaining order across entire populations. Concepts like value, ownership, and authority began to take form, not as physical objects, but as shared understandings that allowed people to coordinate actions, exchange resources, and build stable societies that could grow over time. Money became a tool that connected strangers, enabling trade without direct relationships, while laws created boundaries that defined acceptable behavior, and institutions provided structure to manage complexity at a scale never seen before. With these systems in place, progress accelerated even further, because ideas could now move faster, spreading across regions and cultures, constantly evolving as they were shared, refined, and applied in new ways. Knowledge was no longer limited by memory or distance. It could be recorded, preserved, and built upon, creating a foundation that allowed each generation to move further than the last, pushing innovation forward at an increasing pace. This accumulation of knowledge led to advancements in technology, science, and organization, giving humans greater control over their environment and allowing them to solve problems that once seemed impossible. From simple tools to complex machines, from small communities to global systems, each step expanded human capability, increasing efficiency and influence over the world around us. But with this growth came new challenges, because the same systems that allowed humans to dominate also placed pressure on the environment, on resources, and on the balance that had existed for millions of years. For the first time, a single species had the ability to alter the planet itself, affecting ecosystems, climates, and the future of life on Earth, not just locally, but on a global scale. This level of influence introduced a new kind of responsibility, because human actions were no longer limited in impact. They could shape outcomes far beyond immediate surroundings, affecting generations that had yet to exist. And this brings us to the present moment, where humanity stands at a point unlike any other in its history, with the ability to create, to innovate, and to transform, but also the potential to disrupt and destabilize if that power is not used carefully. The question now is no longer how we survived, because that has already been answered through the long journey of adaptation and cooperation, but how we choose to use the abilities that brought us here in the first place. Because the same traits that allowed humans to rise, imagination, communication, cooperation, and adaptability, are still active today, shaping every system, every decision, and every direction we take as a species. And just as these traits helped our ancestors overcome extreme challenges, they will determine how we face the challenges ahead, whether we continue to grow and improve, or create problems that become harder to solve over time. History shows that progress is not guaranteed. It depends on how these abilities are used, how systems are managed, and how individuals and societies choose to interact with each other and with the world. The future, just like the past, will be shaped by countless small decisions, each one adding to a larger pattern that determines the direction humanity moves in. And this is what makes the human story unique. It is not fixed. It is constantly evolving, shaped by the interaction between ideas, actions, and the systems we create to support them. So when you look at where we are now, it is not just a result of what has already happened, but a starting point for what comes next, because every moment continues to build on everything that came before it. And just like those early humans who faced uncertainty without knowing what the future would hold, we are still moving forward, still adapting, and still shaping the path ahead, guided by the same forces that have always defined us. And as this path continues, something even more subtle begins to emerge. Something that isn't visible in tools or cities or even systems, but exists quietly beneath everything, shaping how humans think, decide, and act without them even realizing it. Because beyond survival, beyond growth, beyond expansion, humans developed something deeper, a constant inner narrative that interprets reality, assigns meaning to experiences, and influences every choice made along the way. This inner layer is what turns events into stories, what transforms simple actions into purpose, and what allows humans to see not just what is, but what could be, creating a gap between reality and imagination that no other species fully experiences. And it is inside that gap that most of human progress is born, because before anything is built in the physical world, it first exists as an idea, a possibility, something imagined before it becomes real. Every invention, every system, every structure that exists today was once nothing more than a thought inside someone's mind, a vision that didn't exist anywhere except in imagination until it was brought into reality through action. This ability to imagine alternative outcomes, to question the present, and to create something new is what continues to drive human evolution forward, even now, long after survival is no longer the primary challenge. But this same ability also introduces complexity, because when humans can imagine better futures, they can also imagine fear, uncertainty, and outcomes that may never happen, creating internal struggles that didn't exist before. The mind becomes both a tool and a challenge, capable of solving problems while also creating them, capable of building clarity while also generating confusion, depending on how it is used. And this is where the modern human experience begins to differ from anything that came before. Because survival is no longer just about the external world. It is also about managing the internal one. The environments humans once had to adapt to were physical, climates, predators, resources. But now, the most complex environment is often the one inside the mind itself, shaped by thoughts, beliefs, and constant streams of information. Decisions are no longer based focused on immediate needs, but on interpretations, expectations, and imagined outcomes, making the process of navigating life more abstract, yet more powerful than ever before. And still, the same core abilities remain at the center of everything. The ability to think, to communicate, to cooperate, and to adapt, just applied in a world that has become more complex than our ancestors could have ever imagined. because even though the environment has changed, the foundation has not. The same cognitive tools that helped early humans survive in harsh landscapes are the ones being used today to navigate modern challenges. The difference is scale, the problems are larger, the systems are more complex, and the speed of change is faster. But the underlying process remains the same. Observe, understand, adapt, and act. And this is what makes the human story ongoing rather than complete, because it is not defined by a single achievement or endpoint, but by continuous movement, constant adjustment, and the ability to respond to whatever comes next. Every generation inherits not only the physical world built by those before them, but also the knowledge, the systems, and the patterns of thinking that shape how they see that world and interact with it. And with each new generation, something shifts. New ideas emerge, old systems are refined or replaced, and the direction of progress changes slightly, creating a chain of development that stretches across time. This chain is what connects the past to the present, and the present to the future, making every moment part of a larger process that continues to unfold, step by step, decision by decision. So, as the story moves forward, it carries with it everything that has already happened, every adaptation, every innovation, every lesson learned through trial and error, all contributing to what humanity becomes next. And just like before, the outcome is not predetermined. It depends on how these elements come together, how choices are made, and how the balance between imagination and reality is managed in the time ahead. And as this balance continues to shift, a new realization begins to take shape, one that quietly sits beneath everything humans have built, suggesting that the real power was never just in tools, systems, or even knowledge, but in the ability to direct attention and intention with precision. Because when you look closely, every major change in human history started the same way, not with action, but with focus, with someone paying attention to something others ignored, seeing patterns others missed, and choosing to explore it further. Attention became the hidden force behind progress, the mechanism that determines what gets improved, what gets ignored, and ultimately what shapes the future, because what humans focus on expands through effort and repetition. And over time, as the world became more complex, controlling attention became more difficult, because there were more signals, more distractions, and more competing inputs trying to influence how people think and what they choose to prioritize. In earlier environments, attention was guided by survival, hunger, danger, opportunity. But in modern environments, it is often guided by external systems designed to capture and hold it for as long as possible. This shift changes everything, because when attention is constantly pulled in different directions, it becomes harder to think deeply, harder to reflect, and harder to make intentional decisions that align with long-term outcomes. And yet, the ability to regain control of attention remains one of the most powerful skills a human can develop, because it directly influences learning, decision-making, and the ability to create meaningful change. The same brain that once scanned the horizon for predators is now navigating streams of information, constantly filtering what matters and what does not, deciding where to invest time and energy. And this is where modern challenges begin to mirror ancient ones in a different form, because just as early humans had to choose where to go, what to hunt, and how to survive, humans today must choose what to focus on, what to build, and how to move forward in a world full of possibilities. The difference is that the consequences are now amplified, because decisions made by individuals and groups can influence not just small communities, but entire systems that affect millions of people. And this creates a feedback loop where small choices, repeated over time, scale into large outcomes, shaping industries, cultures, and even global trends in ways that are not always immediately visible. But at the core, the process remains consistent. Attention leads to action. Action leads to results. And results reinforce patterns that either improve or limit future possibilities depending on how they are managed. This is why some ideas spread rapidly while others disappear, why some systems grow stronger while others collapse, and why certain paths lead to progress while others create resistance and stagnation. Because the direction of movement is not random, it is influenced by what individuals and societies repeatedly choose to invest in, refine, and expand over time. And this brings the focus back to something simple but critical: the ability to be aware of where attention is going, and whether it is being used intentionally or shaped by external forces without conscious choice. Because when awareness increases, so does control. And with control comes the ability to influence outcomes, rather than simply reacting to them as they happen. And this is where the human advantage continues to exist, not just in intelligence or technology, but in the ability to reflect, adjust, and redirect effort toward better solutions when needed. The same adaptability that allowed humans to survive extreme conditions still applies, just in a different context, one where the environment is shaped as much by information and systems as it is by physical reality. And as we move further into this unfolding story, another layer becomes impossible to ignore: a quiet but powerful force that has been shaping human behavior long before cities, before agriculture, even before language fully formed. That force is the need for meaning, the instinct to not just live, but to understand why we live, to connect actions with purpose, and to see patterns that give direction to existence beyond simple survival. Because once humans develop the ability to imagine, they also develop the need to explain, to create frameworks that made sense of the unknown, turning uncertainty into something that felt structured and predictable. This is where beliefs were born, not just as abstract ideas, but as tools that helped humans navigate a world that was often unpredictable and dangerous, giving them a sense of control even when control was limited. Over time, these beliefs evolved into systems, into shared understandings that guided behavior, influenced decisions, and created cohesion within groups by aligning individuals under common perspectives. These systems didn't need to be physically real to be effective. They only needed to be collectively accepted, and once they were, they became powerful enough to shape entire civilizations. They defined what was right and wrong, what was valuable and what was not, what should be pursued and what should be avoided, creating invisible structures that guided millions of people without direct enforcement. And this ability to operate within shared meanings is what allowed humans to organize at scales that no other species could achieve, because cooperation no longer depended only on personal relationships, but on shared understanding. But at the same time, this introduced complexity, because different groups could develop different systems, different interpretations of meaning, leading to both cooperation within groups and conflict between them. And throughout history, this dual nature has remained constant. The same mechanisms that create unity can also create division, depending on how they are applied and how rigidly they are held. Yet even with this complexity, the underlying process remains consistent. Humans seek meaning, they create systems to explain it, and then they act based on those systems, reinforcing them over time. This cycle shapes culture, influences progress, and determines how societies evolve, because what people believe directly impacts how they behave and what they build together. And as knowledge expands, these belief systems continue to adapt, integrating new information, refining old ideas, and sometimes completely transforming when existing frameworks can no longer explain new realities. This is how shifts happen, not instantly, but gradually, as new perspectives gain traction, spread through communication, and eventually become part of the collective understanding. And when that happens, entire directions can change, because once people see the world differently, they begin to act differently, creating new patterns that replace the old ones. This process has repeated throughout history, from early myths to scientific revolutions, from simple explanations of natural events to complex theories that describe the universe itself. Each step represents an expansion of understanding, a refinement of how humans interpret reality, and a shift in how they choose to interact with the world around them. And now, in the present moment, this process is accelerating again, as access to information increases, as ideas spread faster than ever, and as individuals have more influence over collective direction than at any point before. Which means the story is not slowing down, it is speeding up, shaped by more inputs, more interactions, and more possibilities than ever before, making the path ahead both uncertain and full of potential. And just like at every point in the past, the outcome will depend on how humans interpret what they see, what they choose to believe, and how they act on those beliefs as they continue moving forward. And as this acceleration continues, another shift becomes clear, one that moves beyond systems and beliefs into something even more immediate, the moment-to-moment decisions that shape behavior in real time. Because while large structures guide direction, it is the small, repeated choices that determine momentum, the daily actions that either reinforce existing patterns or slowly reshape them over time. Every habit, every reaction, every adjustment contributes to a larger trajectory, creating outcomes that often feel sudden, but are actually the result of consistent, accumulated decisions. This is how change really happens, not in a single breakthrough moment, but in sequences of behavior that build gradually until the result becomes visible and undeniable. And when you look at it this way, the difference between progress and stagnation is not always about knowledge or ability, but about how consistently those are applied in the right direction. Because humans already have access to tools, information, and systems that previous generations could not even imagine, yet the challenge often lies in how those resources are used, rather than their availability. This creates a gap between potential and reality, where outcomes depend not just on what is possible, but on what is actually executed, refined, and sustained over time. And this gap is where discipline, focus, and clarity begin to matter more than raw intelligence, because without consistent application, even the best ideas remain inactive. The environment continues to evolve, introducing new variables, new challenges, and new opportunities. But the core mechanism remains unchanged. Observe, decide, act, adjust, and repeat. Each cycle improves understanding, reduces uncertainty, and increases the ability to respond effectively to changing conditions, creating a feedback loop that drives continuous development. And the faster this loop operates, the faster progress can be made, because mistakes are identified earlier, improvements are implemented sooner, and results begin to compound more quickly. But speed alone is not enough, because without direction, faster movement can lead to greater inefficiency, making it essential to align actions with clear objectives that guide effort toward meaningful outcomes. This is where strategy becomes critical, not as a fixed plan, but as a flexible framework that adapts as new information becomes available, allowing movement without losing direction. And within this framework, learning becomes a constant process, not limited to formal education, but integrated into every experience, every interaction, and every decision made along the way. Because the ability to learn quickly and apply that learning effectively is what allows humans to stay adaptive, even in environments that change faster than expected. And this adaptability is what continues to separate progress from decline, because those who adjust efficiently maintain momentum, while those who resist change begin to fall behind. At scale, this applies not just to individuals, but to entire systems, organizations, and societies, where the ability to evolve determines long-term stability and growth. The same principles that guided early human survival are still active, just operating in more complex environments with higher stakes and broader impact. And as these principles continue to play out, the pattern remains consistent: continuous adjustment, strategic action, and the ability to respond effectively to whatever emerges next. And as these patterns continue repeating, another dimension begins to stand out: the role of time in shaping outcomes, not just as something that passes, but as a resource that can be invested, wasted, or leveraged depending on how it is used. Because every decision interacts with time, some create immediate results but fade quickly, while others require patience but compound into something far more significant over the long run. This distinction is what separates short-term reactions from long-term progress: the ability to delay immediate comfort in exchange for outcomes that are more valuable and more sustainable over time. And throughout human history, the individuals and societies that understood this dynamic were able to build systems that lasted because they prioritized consistency over urgency and direction over speed. This is where compounding becomes one of the most powerful forces in human development. Small improvements repeated consistently, leading to results that appear exponential rather than linear. A single improvement might seem insignificant on its own, but when applied repeatedly, it creates momentum, and that momentum begins to generate outcomes that are far greater than the initial effort would suggest. This applies to knowledge, skills, relationships, and systems. All of them grow stronger through repeated investment, gradually building layers that reinforce each other and increase overall effectiveness. But compounding works both ways, because just as positive actions accumulate into progress, negative patterns accumulate into limitation, making it critical to recognize which direction is being reinforced over time. And this awareness is what allows adjustments to happen early, before patterns become too deeply established to change easily, giving humans the ability to redirect their trajectory when needed. The challenge is that these patterns are often subtle at the beginning, almost invisible, making it easy to overlook them until the results become more pronounced. By the time outcomes are clearly visible, the underlying behaviors have usually been repeated enough times to create a stable direction, either forward or backward, depending on the choices made. This is why intentionality becomes so important, not just reacting to outcomes, but actively shaping the inputs that lead to those outcomes in the first place. Because when inputs are controlled, outputs become more predictable, and the ability to influence results increases significantly over time. And this creates a sense of stability even in changing environments, because instead of relying on external conditions, progress is driven by internal consistency and structured effort. This is the same principle that allowed early humans to survive unpredictable environments, creating systems that reduced uncertainty and increased reliability in the face of constant change. Now, the context is different, but the principle remains the same. Build processes that work over time, refine them continuously, and allow results to emerge through repetition and improvement. And as these processes evolve, they begin to integrate with larger systems, connecting individual effort with collective outcomes, where small contributions scale into broader impact. This is how industries grow, how cultures shift, and how entire directions change, not through isolated events, but through consistent patterns applied across many individuals and systems simultaneously. And within this complexity, the same core mechanism continues to operate. Time combined with action creates outcomes, and those outcomes feed back into future decisions, shaping the path forward step by step. And as this cycle deepens, another factor begins to influence everything at a higher level: the way humans interpret feedback, not just receiving results, but deciding what those results actually mean. Because outcomes by themselves are neutral, it is the interpretation that gives them direction, turning them into signals for improvement or reasons to stop, depending on how they are understood. This is where perception starts to shape reality, not by changing facts, but by influencing how humans respond to those facts, determining whether they adjust, persist, or shift direction entirely. Two people can face the same result and move in completely different ways. One sees limitation, the other sees information, and that difference in interpretation creates entirely different paths over time. And this is why feedback loops are so powerful, because they don't just provide data, they influence behavior, and behavior is what ultimately determines outcomes. When feedback is used effectively, it accelerates growth, because each result becomes a reference point that improves the next action, reducing errors and increasing efficiency with every cycle. But when feedback is ignored or misinterpreted, the same mistakes repeat. Patterns remain unchanged, and progress slows down or stops altogether without obvious reason. This is where awareness becomes a key advantage, the ability to step back, analyze results objectively, and extract useful information rather than reacting emotionally or impulsively. Because once feedback is seen clearly, it becomes a tool for refinement, allowing continuous improvement instead of random variation, and turning experience into structured learning. Over time, this creates precision. Actions become more accurate, decisions become more aligned, and outcomes become more consistent, not by chance, but by design. And as precision increases, efficiency follows, less wasted effort, fewer unnecessary steps, and more direct movement toward desired results, all driven by better interpretation of information. This is how expertise develops, not just through repetition, but through deliberate adjustment based on feedback, refining each iteration until performance reaches a higher level. At a larger scale, the same principle applies to systems, organizations, and societies, where the ability to interpret feedback correctly determines whether structures improve or decline over time. Systems that adapt based on accurate signals become stronger and more resilient, while those that ignore or distort feedback become fragile, eventually breaking under pressure. This dynamic is constant. It doesn't stop. It continues shaping outcomes whether it is acknowledged or not, making awareness of it a critical factor in long-term progress. And as complexity increases, the ability to filter meaningful signals from noise becomes even more important, because not all feedback is useful, and not all inputs should influence decisions. This requires clarity, knowing what matters, what aligns with objectives, and what can be ignored without affecting overall direction, allowing focus to remain on what truly drives results. And within this process, the same loop continues. Action creates feedback. Feedback shapes interpretation. Interpretation influences the next action, forming a continuous cycle of development. The more effectively this cycle is managed, the more controlled progress becomes, shifting from unpredictable outcomes to structured advancement built on consistent learning and adjustment. And as this loop becomes more refined, another layer begins to emerge. The role of identity in shaping behavior, not just what people do, but how they see themselves while doing it. Because actions are often aligned with internal definitions, with the stories people tell themselves about who they are, what they are capable of, and what they believe is possible for them. This means behavior is not driven only by logic or external circumstances, but by internal alignment, by whether an action feels consistent with a person's sense of self or not. When identity and action are aligned, consistency becomes natural, effort feels directed, and progress builds with less resistance, because behavior reinforces belief, and belief reinforces behavior. But when there is a gap between identity and action, friction appears, hesitation increases, and even simple steps begin to feel more difficult than they actually are. This is why lasting change rarely comes from forcing behavior alone. It comes from shifting the underlying perspective that defines what feels natural and what feels out of place. Because once identity adjusts, actions tend to follow, not as isolated efforts, but as expressions of a new baseline that gradually replaces the old one. And this process is not instant. It develops through repetition, through consistent behavior, that slowly reshapes internal perception until the new pattern feels stable. Over time, small aligned actions accumulate into a different sense of capability, creating confidence not from assumptions, but from evidence built through experience. This confidence then feeds back into the system, encouraging more action, more refinement, and more progress, reinforcing the cycle in a positive direction. At scale, identity extends beyond individuals to groups, organizations, and societies, where shared beliefs about what is possible influence collective behavior and long-term direction. Cultures that see themselves as adaptive, innovative, and capable tend to act in ways that support those qualities, while those that adopt limiting narratives often reinforce constraints through repeated behavior. This is how large shifts happen, not only through external changes, but through internal redefinition, where what is considered normal, possible, or expected begins to evolve. And as these definitions shift, so do the systems built around them, because structures reflect the mindset of the people creating and maintaining them. This creates another feedback loop. Identity shapes action. Action shapes results. Results reinforce identity, gradually stabilizing patterns that can either support growth or limit it. Recognizing this loop allows intentional change, not by forcing outcomes, but by adjusting the underlying narrative that guides behavior over time. Because once the narrative changes, the direction of action changes with it. And over time, that shift becomes visible in results, not as a sudden transformation, but as a steady movement in a new direction. And as this continues, identity becomes less fixed and more flexible, adapting based on experience, learning, and deliberate adjustment rather than remaining static. This flexibility is what keeps progress possible, allowing continuous evolution instead of rigid patterns that eventually become outdated in changing environments. And as identity becomes more flexible, another mechanism starts to shape everything at a deeper level, the way humans handle uncertainty, not by eliminating it, but by learning how to operate within it. Because uncertainty has always been part of the human experience, from early environments where survival depended on unpredictable conditions, to modern systems where outcomes are influenced by countless variables. The difference is not the presence of uncertainty, but the response to it, whether it becomes a barrier that stops movement or a space that allows exploration and adaptation. Those who can function effectively without needing complete clarity are able to move faster, test more ideas, and adjust earlier, turning uncertainty into a productive environment rather than a limiting one. This is where experimentation becomes essential, not as random action, but as structured attempts to learn, where each step provides information that reduces uncertainty over time. Instead of waiting for perfect conditions, progress comes from acting with partial information, observing the results, and refining the approach continuously. And this approach creates momentum because movement generates feedback. Feedback improves understanding, and improved understanding leads to better decisions in the next iteration. Over time, uncertainty decreases, not because everything becomes predictable, but because the ability to respond improves, making outcomes more manageable even when conditions change. This is how adaptability scales, not by controlling every variable, but by becoming capable of adjusting to whatever variables appear. At a larger level, this principle shapes innovation, where new ideas are tested, refined, and integrated into existing systems, gradually expanding what is possible. And within this process, failure becomes part of development rather than something to avoid, because each unsuccessful attempt still provides information that contributes to future success. The key is not eliminating mistakes, but learning from them efficiently, reducing repetition of ineffective patterns while strengthening effective ones. This requires a shift in perspective, seeing outcomes as data rather than judgments, allowing continuous improvement without being limited by temporary results. And as this mindset develops, resilience increases, because challenges are no longer seen as obstacles that stop progress, but as inputs that refine direction. This creates stability in dynamic environments, because instead of relying on fixed conditions, progress is built on the ability to adjust under changing circumstances. And this is the same principle that has carried human development from the beginning. Constant interaction with the unknown, continuous adaptation, and gradual expansion of capability through experience. The context changes, the scale increases, but the process remains consistent. Observe, act, learn, adjust, and repeat. And as long as this process continues, movement continues, shaping outcomes step by step, even when the final direction is not fully visible in advance. And as this cycle of acting under uncertainty continues, another layer starts to influence outcomes in a more subtle way. The accumulation of experience and how it shapes intuition over time. Because repetition doesn't just improve skill, it builds patterns in the mind, allowing faster recognition of situations and more efficient decision-making without needing to analyze every detail from scratch. This is what turns conscious effort into automatic response, where actions that once required focus become natural, freeing up mental capacity to handle more complex challenges. And as intuition develops, decisions become quicker and more precise, not because they are random, but because they are built on a foundation of repeated exposure and learned patterns. However, intuition is only as reliable as the experiences that formed it, meaning that accurate learning leads to effective instincts, while repeated mistakes without correction can reinforce inefficient patterns. This is why reflection becomes essential. The ability to review past actions, identify what worked and what didn't, and adjust future behavior based on that understanding. Without reflection, experience remains unstructured and growth slows down, because lessons are not fully extracted from what has already happened. But when reflection is applied consistently, experience transforms into knowledge, and knowledge becomes a guide for future decisions, improving accuracy over time. This creates a compounding effect where each cycle of action and reflection increases clarity, reduces uncertainty, and strengthens the ability to respond effectively in similar situations. At scale, this process shapes expertise, where individuals or systems develop deep understanding within specific domains, allowing them to operate with a level of precision that appears effortless from the outside. And as expertise grows, so does efficiency. Fewer resources are wasted, fewer errors are made, and outcomes become more consistent, because actions are based on refined understanding rather than guesswork. This is how mastery develops, not through isolated breakthroughs, but through continuous cycles of action, feedback, and refinement applied over extended periods of time. And this same principle applies beyond individuals, influencing how organizations improve, how industries evolve, and how entire systems become more effective through accumulated knowledge. Because when knowledge is shared and built upon, it doesn't just improve one person's performance, it elevates the capability of the entire group, creating a collective advantage that grows over time. This is how progress scales, from individual improvement to collective advancement, where each contribution adds to a larger system that becomes stronger and more capable with every iteration. And now, after everything we've traced, from the earliest moments of survival to the systems, patterns, and behaviors shaping life today, something becomes clear in a very simple way. This story was never just about how humans became the dominant species. It was about how small shifts, repeated over time, created outcomes that once seemed impossible. It was about how thinking turned into action, how action turned into systems, and how those systems shaped the world we now live in. And when you look at it closely, the same process is still happening right now. In every decision, every habit, and every direction chosen moving forward. Because the journey didn't stop at any point we talked about. It continued, and it is still continuing, shaped by the same forces that have always been there. The ability to imagine, to adapt, to learn, and to act. These are not just traits from the past. They are active tools that define what happens next. So wherever you are right now, whatever time it is for you, you are part of that same story, not separate from it, but inside it, contributing to what it becomes over time. And maybe the most interesting part is this: the future isn't something waiting to happen. It is something being built moment by moment in ways that are not always obvious at first. So as everything continues moving forward, the same pattern remains: observe, think, act, adjust, and keep going. Because just like before, the next chapter is not written yet.